Hello, welcome to Chapter 11. Fiscal Policy, the Keynesian View, and the Historical Development of Macroeconomics. The Great Depression, economic instability, and the development of Keynesian economics, which was a direct result of what happened during the Great Depression. I believe myself to be writing a book on economic theory which will largely revolutionize, not, I suppose, at once, but in the course of the next 10 years, the way the world thinks about economics. John Maynard Keynes. The Great Depression exerted a huge impact on macroeconomics. The national income account that was used to measure GDP were developed during this era, and several of the basic concepts of macroeconomics and much of the terminology were initially introduced during the 1930s. Keynesian economics was also an outgrowth of the Great Depression. John Maynard Keynes was the most influential economist of the 20th century. His analysis of the Great Depression altered the views of the economics profession. He even foresaw the impact of his work. Keynes developed a theory that provided both an explanation for the prolonged unemployment of the 1930s and a recipe for how to generate a recovery. Keynesian analysis indicated that fiscal policy could be used to maintain a high level of output and employment. The Keynesian view dominated macroeconomics for the 3 decades following World War II. Keynesian economics began to wane during the 1970s because it was unable to explain the simultaneous occurrence of high unemployment and inflation. But the severe recession of 2008 to 2009 generated renewed interest in Keynesian analysis. This chapter will present the Keynesian view of fiscal policy and consider how it has evolved through time. The next chapter will focus on alternative theories and consider incentive effects that are largely ignored within the Keynesian framework. Taken together, these 2 chapters provide a balanced presentation of current views of the potential and limitations of fiscal policy as a stabilization tool. The Great Depression macro adjustment process. Prior to the Great Depression, most economists thought market adjustments would direct an economy back to full employment rather quickly. The Great Depression's length and severity changed these views. The depth and length of the economic decline during the 1930s is difficult to comprehend. Between 1929 and 1933, real GDP fell by more than 30%. In 1933, nearly 25% of the U.S. labor force was unemployed. The depressed conditions continued. In 1939, a decade after the plunge began, the rate of unemployment was still 17%, and per capita income was virtually the same as a decade earlier. Keynes provided an explanation for the prolonged depressed conditions of the 1930s. He argued that spending motivated firms to produce output. If spending fell because of pessimism and other factors, firms would reduce production. When an economy is in recession, Keynesians do not believe that reductions in either resource prices or interest rates will promote recovery. As a result, market economies are likely to experience recessions that are both severe and lengthy. In the Keynesian model, firms will produce the amount of goods and services they believe people plan to buy. Equilibrium occurs when total spending equals current output. When this is the case, producers have no reason to expand or contract output. If total spending demand is deficient, depressed conditions and high levels of unemployment will persist. This is precisely what Keynes believed happened during the 1930s. If total spending is less than full employment output, inventories will rise and firms will reduce output and employment. The lower level of output and employment will persist as long as total spending is less than output. Total spending, AD, is key to the Keynesian macroeconomic model. Keynes believed that the cause of the Great Depression was weak aggregate demand or deficient total spending on goods and services. Keynes might probably be referred to as the father of macroeconomics. His general theory of employment, interest, and money, published in 1936, revolutionized the way that economists think about macroeconomics. Keynes's work was groundbreaking and was controversial. He argued that government should run budget deficits during a recession to stimulate demand and direct the economy back to full employment. But this idea challenged the entrenched views of both policymakers and economists. Nonetheless, his ideas soon triumphed and dominated the thinking of macroeconomists for 3 decades. Most observers would rate Keynes as the most influential economist of the 20th century. The multiplier principle, the concept that an independent change in expenditures, such as investment, leads to an even larger change in aggregate output. The multiplier concept builds on the point that one individual's spending becomes the income of another. Income recipients will spend a portion of their additional earnings on consumption. In turn, their consumption expenditures will generate additional income for others who also spend a portion of it. Thus, growth in spending can expand output by a multiple of the original increase. The multiplier concept is fundamentally based upon the proportion of additional income that households choose to spend on consumption. The marginal propensity to consume, here assumed to be 75%, equals 3/4. Here, a $1 million injection is spent, received as payment, saved and spent, received as payment, saved and spent, etc., until effectively $4 million is spent in the economy. The term multiplier is also used to indicate the number by which the initial changes in spending is multiplied to obtain the total increase in output. In the previous example, a $1 million initial increase in spending expanded output by a total of $4 million. Thus, the multiplier was 4. The size of the multiplier increases with the marginal propensity to consume, also known as MPC. Specifically, the relationship between the MPC and the multiplier follows this equation. M equals 1 over 1 minus MPC. The multiplier and economic instability. The multiplier concept also works in reverse. Reductions in spending will also be magnified and generate even larger reductions in income. Even a minor disturbance may be amplified into a major disruption because of the multiplier. Keynesians argue that the multiplier concept indicates that market economies have a tendency to fluctuate back and forth between excessive demand that generates an economic boom and deficient demand that leads to recession. Adding realism to the multiplier. In evaluating the importance of the multiplier, remember, an increase in government spending will require either higher taxes or additional government borrowing. This will often generate secondary effects, reducing spending in other areas. It takes time for the multiplier to work. The multiplier effect implies the additional spending brings idle resources into production without price changes, unlikely to be the case during normal times. During normal times, the demand stimulus effect of additional spending is substantially weaker than the multiplier suggests. Keynes and economic instability, a summary. According to the Keynesian view, fluctuations in total spending are the major source of economic instability. Keynesians believe that market economies have a tendency to fluctuate between economic booms, driven by excessive demand, and recessions resulting from insufficient demand. The multiplier principle explains why these fluctuations are magnified. The federal budget and fiscal policy. Budget deficits and surpluses. A budget deficit is present when total government spending exceeds total revenue from all sources. When the money supply is constant, deficits must be covered with borrowing. The U.S. Treasury borrows by issuing bonds. A budget surplus, a distant memory, is present when total government spending is greater than total revenue. Surpluses reduce the magnitude of the government's outstanding debt. Changes in the size of the federal deficit or surplus are often used to gauge whether fiscal policy is stimulating or restraining demand. Changes in the size of the budget deficit or surplus may arise from either a change in cyclical economic conditions, or a change in discretionary fiscal policy. The federal budget is the primary tool of fiscal policy. Discretionary changes in fiscal policy, deliberate changes in government spending and/or taxes designed to affect the size of the budget deficit or surplus. Fiscal policy and the good news of Keynesian economics. Keynesian theory highlights the potential of fiscal policy as a tool capable of reducing fluctuations in AD, aggregate demand. Prior to the Great Depression, most believed that the government should balance its budget. Keynesians challenged this view. Rather than balancing the budget annually, Keynesians argue that counter-cyclical policy should be used to offset fluctuations in AD. This implies that the government should plan budget deficits when the economy is weak and budget surpluses when the strong demand threatens to cause inflation. When an economy is operating below its potential output, the Keynesian economic model suggests that fiscal policy should be more expansionary, increase in government purchases of goods and services, or a reduction in taxes. Expansionary fiscal policy at E1 is right here. The economy is below its potential capacity, which is YF, which is here. There are two routes to long-run full employment inquiry. One, rely on lower resource prices to reduce costs and increase supply to SRAS sub 2, restoring equilibrium at YFE3. Right here. Alternatively, expansionary fiscal policy could stimulate AD and direct the economy back to YF. When inflation is a potential problem, Keynesian analysis suggests fiscal policy should be more restrictive, reduction in government spending or an increase in taxes. This is how Keynesian policy is used to combat inflation. Restrictive fiscal policy, strong demand such as AD1 will temporarily lead an output rate beyond the economy's long-run potential. If maintained, the strong demand will lead to the long-run equilibrium, E3, at a higher price level. Restrictive financial policy could reduce demand to AD2 or keep AD from shifting to A1 initially and lead to equilibrium E2. And we can see that in the charts here. The Keynesian view of fiscal policy summary. The federal budget is the primary tool of fiscal policy. Keynesians stress the importance of counter-cyclical policy. The budget should shift toward deficit The budget should shift toward deficit when the economy is threatened by recession. The budget should shift toward surplus when inflation is a threat. Problems with proper timing. There are three major reasons why it is difficult to time fiscal policy changes in a manner that promotes stability. It takes time to institute a legislative change. There is a time lag between when a change is instituted and when it exerts significant impact. These time lags imply that sound policy requires knowledge of economic conditions 9 to 18 months into the future, but our ability to forecast future conditions is limited. Problems with proper timing. Discretionary fiscal policy is like a two-edged sword. It can both harm and help. If timed correctly, it may reduce economic instability. If timed incorrectly, however, it may increase economic instability. Automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers without any new legislative action. These tools will increase the budget deficit, reduce the surplus during a recession, and increase the surplus, reduce the deficit during an economic boom. The major advantage of automatic stabilizers is that they institute counter-cyclical fiscal policy without the delays associated with legislative action. Examples of automatic stabilizers: unemployment compensation, corporate profit tax, progressive income tax. Questions for thought. Number one, what is the multiplier principle? Does the multiplier principle make it more or less difficult to stabilize the economy? Explain. Why did John Maynard Keynes think the high level of unemployment persisted during the Great Depression? What did he think needed to be done to avoid the destructive impact of circumstances like those of the 1930s? Savings, spending, debt, and the impact of fiscal policy. Paradoxes of thrift and spending. The paradox of thrift, the idea that when a large number of households increase their savings and reduce consumption, their actions may reduce aggregate consumption and throw the economy into a recession. Keynesians often stress the dangers implied by the paradox of thrift and excessive saving. The paradox of thrift indicates that efforts to save more could reduce the overall demand for goods and services, causing businesses to reduce output and lay off workers. The paradox of excessive consumption. While an increase in consumption might temporarily boost AD, households will face financial troubles if they save little and spend most of what they earn and borrow on current consumption. Even though the incomes of Americans are the highest in history, so too is their financial anxiety. We cannot have a strong and healthy economy when households are heavily indebted and face persistent financial troubles because their savings rate is low. Household debt as a share of after-tax income between 1960 and 2019. The household debt to income ratio for Americans has increased steadily since the mid-1980s. The debt to disposable income ratio of households soared to 130% in 2007, approximately twice the level of the 1960s and the 1970s. During the years following the Great Recession, household debt declined as a share of after-tax income. Household debt in the 2008 to 2009 recession. The historically high level of debt meant households were in a weak position to deal with the recession of 2008 and 2009. As a result of their high debt and income ratio, households were reluctant to spend additional income. Thus, the Keynesian tax rebates and federal spending increases of the Bush and Obama administrations were largely ineffective. Even with budget deficits of 10% of GDP, output was sluggish and unemployment remained high in 2009 and 2012. Questions for thought. Why is the proper timing of changes in fiscal policy so important? Why is it difficult to achieve? Question number 2. Automatic stabilizers are government programs that tend to A, bring expenditures and revenues automatically into balance without legislative action. B, shift the budget toward a deficit when the economy slows, but shift it towards a surplus during an expansion. And number 3, increase tax collections automatically during a recession. Question number 3, when households are heavily indebted, what are they likely to do with an unexpected increase in income, such as a tax rebate? How will this impact the effectiveness of expansionary fiscal policy? That's the end of chapter 11. Thank you very much for listening.